They can take powers away from the states, give them to the federal government or to some international body. They can cut across the rights given to the people by their constitutional Bill of Rights. A Senate amendment proposed by Republican Senator John Bricker would have provided that no treaty could supersede the Constitution. But it failed to pass by one vote. Interesting. Interesting. Now, as you read this history, you stop and think, I don't know if you visited Yosemite National Park or Yellowstone National Park, but you may be aware from newspaper articles that they are now policed by the United Nations. They're not a national park because we apparently weren't diligent in doing it the way the UN thought it ought to be done, so they've taken them over on the basis of the Heritage Act of 1974. That's kind of interesting. So this isn't academic. This isn't just a history course of people's thinking. It's manifestation of a tide of a conspiracy. When I was in Liechtenstein with our ambassador, Admiral Bill Middendorf, and Howard Phillips, Conservative Caucus, I remember asking Howard, because he's probably one of the best informed guys in Washington, and a Christian, really growing too, by the way, neat guy. And because of some other flack I was getting recently, I had to refresh my memory on what happened in Liechtenstein, because I had to admit I had forgotten some details. So I called Howard, and he filled me in on those details. But I remember in that conversation back then, I asked Howard, I said, I really try to get a perspective of the so-called conspiracy thing. And he says, Chuck, there isn't one conspiracy, there are many. There's just as many struggles for power within the extreme left as there are anywhere else. The collective effect, of course, is a tide and a trend, and indeed there is a master conspirator that gave his name to one of the trusts involved. Okay? All right. Now, 1954, Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, he establishes a group that's come to call the Bilderbergers, because that's where they met the first time. International politicians, bankers, and they meet secretly on an annual basis. And the secrecy of those meetings has finally been punctured, and we now know a great deal about them. But anyway, in 1958, The World Peace Through World Law was published, where authors Grenville Clark and Louis Sohn advocate using the UN as a governing body for the world and world disarmament and world police force and so on. 59, the Council of Foreign Relations calls for a new international order. Study number 7, issued on November 25, advocated, quote, a new international order which must be responsive to world aspirations for peace, social and economic change, international order, including states labeling themselves as socialist. Read that, communist. The only difference, communist is simply a socialist with a gun that's in a hurry. 1959, or somebody once quipped, I think, that a socialist is a communist who knows what he's doing. 1959, the World Constitution Parliament Association is founded. It later develops the diagram for world government under the Constitution for the Federation of Earth. 1959, also the Mid-Century Challenge to the United States Foreign Policy. It's published by the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. It explains that the U.S., quote, cannot escape and indeed should welcome the task which history has imposed upon us. This is the task of helping to shape a new world order in all its dimensions, spiritual, economic, political, and social. Did you get that? Spiritual, economic, political, and social. September 9th, 1960, President Eisenhower signs the Senate Joint Resolution 170, promoting the concept of a federal Atlantic Union. An address is later given and called The Goal of the Government of All the World, in which stated, for it becomes clear that the first step of the world government cannot be completed until we have advanced on 4 fronts, the economic, the military, the political, and social. In 1961, the United States State Department issues a plan to disarm all nations and arm the United Nations. State Department document number 7277 is entitled Freedom from War, the U.S. Program for the General and Complete Disarmament of a Peaceful World. It details a 3-stage plan to disarm all nations and arm the United Nations, with a final stage in which no state would have the military power to challenge the progressively strengthened United Nations. Interesting. 62, new calls for world federalism. And I don't want to badger all of these stuff. I'm just trying to give you a flavor. This is a tide. It's got a long, deep history, but the labeling, the goals, the insights don't come from the right or the extremists or the militias. They come from the people doing it, for anyone that's done their homework. 1963, J. William Fulbright, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, speaks at a symposium sponsored by the Fund for the Republic, a left-wing project of the Ford Foundation. Says, quote, the case for government by elites is irrefutable. Government by the people is possible, but highly improbable, close quote. In 1964, the Taxonomy of Educational Objectives, Handbook 2, author Benjamin Bloom states, a large part of what we call good teaching is the teacher's ability to attain effective objectives through challenging the student's fixed beliefs. You see, his outcome-based education method of teaching would be first tried as mastery learning in the Chicago schools, and after 5 years, the Chicago students' test scores had plummeted, causing an outrage among the parents. But the OBE would leave a trail of wreckage wherever it would be tried, and under whatever name it was used. And at the same time, it would become crucial to the globalists for overwhelming and overhauling the educational system to promote attitude changes by the school students. In 1964, Visions of Order by Richard Weaver is published. He describes progressive educators as a revolutionary cabal engaged in systematic attempt to undermine society's traditions and beliefs. In 1967, Richard Nixon calls for a new world order. In his publication Asia After Vietnam, in the October issue of Foreign Affairs, Nixon writes of the nation's dispositions to evolve regional approaches to development needs and to the evolution of a new world order. And on this goes. In July of 26, 1968, Nelson Rockefeller pledges support of the New World Order. In Associated Press report, he pledges that as president he would work toward an international creation of a New World Order. In 1972, Nixon visits China in his toast to Chinese Premier Chou En-lai, former CFR member and now president. Richard Nixon expresses the hope that each of us has to build a new world order. In speaking of the coming of world government, Roy Ash, director of the Office of Management and Budget, you may remember him as a partner of Tex Thornton in the Lytton thing, but anyway, he declares that within 2 decades, the institutional framework for a world economic community will be in place, and aspects of individual sovereignty will be given over to a supranational authority. Of course, in 1973, that's when the Trilateral Commission was established. Banker David Rockefeller organized this private body and chose Brzezinski, later to become the National Security Advisor to President Carter, as the Commission's first director, and invites Jimmy Carter to become a founding member. And I do have a report that Jimmy Carter, when he was running, was given a list of Christians and conservatives for the cabinet. We're hoping that someone would have been appointed. And this friend of mine, I'll leave it nameless for the moment, in talking to Jimmy was in tears. He was not allowed to make one appointment. They were all dictated to him. 1973, Humanist Manifesto II is published. The next century may be and should be a humanistic century. We stand at the dawn of a new age, a secular society on a planetary scale. As non-theists, we begin with humans, not God, nature, not deity. We deplore the division of humankind on nationalistic grounds. Thus, we look to the development of a system of world law and world order based upon transnational federal government. The true revolution is occurring. But study after study, anyway, from all these people and all these organizations continue. In 1975, retired Navy Admiral Chester Ward, former Judge Advocate General of the United States Navy and former CFR member, writes in a critique that the goal of the CFR is the submergence of U.S. sovereignty and national defense into an all-powerful world government. In 1975, Kissinger on the Couch is published. Authors Phyllis Schlafly and former CFR member Chester Ward state, once the ruling members of the CFR have decided that the U.S. government should espouse a particular policy, the very substantial research facilities of the CFR are put to work to develop arguments, intellectual and emotional, to support the new policy and to confound, discredit, intellectually and politically, any opposition. In 1976, we had the Reshaping the World Order publication by the Globalist Club of Rome, calling for a new international order, including economic redistribution of wealth. And 1977, the third Triad World Order is published by Harlan Cleveland of the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies. It calls for changing Americans' attitudes toward institutions, a complete disarmament except for international soldiers, and for individual entitlement to food, health, and education. So you get the America is the main barrier to this all happening, of course, and so that's the focus here. Let me pick 79. Interesting quote from Barry Goldwater, who is retiring as a Republican senator from Arizona. He published his autobiography called With No Apologies. He said, quote, in my view, the Trilateral Commission represents a skillful, coordinated effort to seize control and consolidate the 4 centers of power: political, monetary, intellectual, and ecclesiastical. All this is to be done in the interest of creating a more peaceful, more productive world community. What the Trilateralists truly intend is the creation of a worldwide economic power superior to the political governments of the nation-states involved. They believe that the abundant materialism they propose to create will overwhelm the existing differences. As managers and creators of the system, they will rule the future. 1985, Norman Cousins, the honorary chairman of the Planetary Citizens of the World We Choose, is quoted in the magazine Human Events as follows, quote, "World government is coming. In fact, it is inevitable. No arguments for or against it can change